This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library of
enough. You can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price that you can get Truefire All Access for.
I love this kind of video. I watched Rob Chapper's. I got sent a video by my buddy Joe Miller, who kind of just sent me this video and he was like, I think this has some interesting points in it. I've actually written a few down. If you've not watched the video, I really suggest that it might be a good one to watch, because Rob Chapman obviously has quite a lot of insight into some of this stuff from, you know, both being like a player, being a person who does demos of guitar gear, but also as a guy who went and started his own guitar company and working in this industry. And he's also saying some things that, you know, someone like Paul Reed Smith might say as well. So check out that video. It's called The Brutal Truth After Playing 4,000 Guitars. I felt that there were a couple of things. Thanks so much to Rob for making that video. I think this is the kind of thing, like when Josh did that response to my awfully stupid video, that is kind of a little bit of insight into what makes the industry work the way it does, which I think is kind of interesting to hear. Now, so some of the points that he made that I'll just quickly kind of gloss over. Price is not about parts. It's more about an evaluation of all of the different relationships in the chain of financial consequence, which is a point that he made, like, about basically someone like Fender or someone like that. Apparently, basically what you do, you kind of have these relationships with all of the bits and pieces, and they charge essentially what they think they can do. It's not necessarily just about having like a fixed margin that you put on top of all your products. So it's not just the sum of parts, the cost of labour, and then you go, okay, and then we're going to put our normal margin on top. So that's kind of an interesting little point there, that I think for me, naively, I just assume really that companies would work on this idea of margin. It's like, well, we can build the guitar for this much, therefore we will charge this much. Like, that's kind of not necessarily a linear thing, right? Interesting. And there's this element of, you know, price, like how much can we charge for it? Let's try that. Will it sell at that price? And that's kind of like an ongoing experiment, right? And he kind of then said, therefore, that price isn't really relative or relevant to the product, which I kind of see what he's saying. So we'll get to why I think some of this does matter. And then he kind of made some points about the guitar being a physics system. So things like wood, the materials that you make, the pickups you choose, the bridge, all of these choices do matter on a guitar, and I think that's definitely true. The point that I think is not explicitly mentioned in the video, which I think deserves mentioning, is that the number one factor into determining how much a guitar costs is entirely where the human element is done, right? I think we all are aware of that, but it's kind of in some ways like a little bit of that elephant in the room thing, right? Because it's like, well, there's lots of ethical concerns and ethical considerations about all of this stuff, right? And I think that is what drives quite a lot of this, right? So in the conclusions of what he said, like he said that people are programmed to believe that brand is better and the origin of manufacturing is better. So not necessarily, I think, so for me in 2025, I essentially think that I know now why a guitar made in America costs what it does, and why a guitar made in England costs what it does, versus a guitar made in China, Indonesia, Taiwan, Korea. I think I know the reason for this, and it's mostly because we have like things like minimum wage, you have to insure and all this sort of stuff, and we don't necessarily, you know, I've not looked into this too much, but that's not necessarily the case in other places, right? And that is the reason that if you buy like the same product from one country versus another, the price can vary hugely. This is not groundbreaking stuff, is it? Beijing has the highest employee minimum wage at like less than $4. The minimum wage in California, I nearly fell over, where obviously the Fender factory is over four times as much. So an hour on a guitar in California, $17 to actually employ someone to do that. It costs more than that to actually employ an employee, right? You have to pay holiday and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know how long an actual guitar takes, but say it took 10 hours of work, 10 hours of work in California, $170, yes, and 10 hours of work in Beijing, $37. The other thing that I think, and this is, I think, something that Chapman has run up against in his own sort of guitar building and guitar company stuff, I think there's a very small number of companies and brands that people are willing to pay a lot of money for. So I think these companies are like Gibson, companies like Fender, maybe Martin and Taylor, PRS. There's very, very, very few of these prestige brands. And I think that's an important consideration to make here, because this is the thing that I think Chapman ended up struggling with when he was building the guitars in England, is that you'd have essentially like an expensive guitar that doesn't have the right name on the headstock. And also I think there's other things where it's like, then the companies that are building boutique guitars ordinarily then have an issue of scale where it's like, well, and you hear quite a lot of stories, I think Tosin Abasi had a story like this as well, where you have like a company that are building the guitars for you, and they're normally quite a small business, and then they try to scale up, and that's where it all starts to fall apart. And this, I think, is a real key to why people in a lot of cases think that older stuff is better or vintage stuff is better. So he made a really good point about vintage guitars being made by artisans, craftsmen, furniture manufacturers, not luthiers. And he was saying they were made differently and sometimes wrong, but he also said they were made in smaller quantities. Now this is the real kicker here. Leo Fender was about trying to make an assembly line type guitar, right? And the Telecaster, the Stratocaster, are very successful examples of this. Not every guitar is like these. Like Gibson were not building guitars that were just essentially parts casters, right? Having said all that, what he's also said is that these were skilled people from other crafts. The scale is the thing that becomes the issue. Making guitars in smaller quantities, I think, is an easier way to ensure quality. But it also will not make tons and tons of money for lots of people. And I think this is really kind of the issue with this stuff, which drives it all. Like, the reason that you'd want to scale up to build lots of guitars in greater quantities is because you make more money from it. The reason that you would want to stay smaller is because you can have a better eye on quality control and all that sort of stuff. So I think there is quite a lot of truth to what Chappers is saying, but I think that is the key difference, is that we're, in Chapman's case, I think he's comparing like mass manufactured guitars, where if they're built in America, there's certain things going on, versus if they're built in Indonesia or Korea or wherever else, there's other things going on. And those two types of guitars are probably actually quite similar. Whereas I think if you go boutique, those are legitimately different. For example, you could pay £300 for this guitar, or you could pay 50 times more for this guitar. Now, what would the differences be? They're both CNC bodies and CNC necks. They're both functional. And what is the difference? Really, it comes down to where the person who's doing a lot of labour on it comes from, and then like how much labour is spent on the guitar. I think this is the point, is that a £300 Chinese guitar, I think this is made in China, maybe Indonesia, people are willing to spend that, but I don't think people are willing to spend, you know, anywhere near the equivalent they'd spend on an American guitar. So we don't really, in many cases, get to see the best of sort of Indonesian, Chinese manufacture. We do get, and this is just a case in point, it's sometimes like a small, like this is an Aria made in Japan, which we didn't really even know they were still doing this. This is a fantastic guitar, but I'm imagining, and I know actually this is the case, they make these in very, very small quantities, and I think that is where you can find really great quality that does stand above the mass manufactured stuff, in my opinion. That's what I've found. And the fact is, I think that in many cases when you're spending £2,000 on an American guitar, like there's this exchange rate where you're spending money on a guitar that has in some cases had quite a bit more time spent on it than, you know, a £300-400 Eastern guitar. And I do also think we're starting to see like this idea that you can spend a bit more on one of these Eastern guitars and get an awful lot more for your money within this realm of mass manufactured guitars. So this is a Sterling that's made in Indonesia. I was really, really, really impressed with this. I think there's a lot of truth to what Chappers is saying, and that, you know, maybe we shouldn't be so concerned with what brand is on there, but at the same time, I just think that people are not willing to spend £5,000, £6,000 on a guitar that's made in China or Indonesia. And for that reason, there isn't really a market for them in the same way. Whereas, you know, £300, £400, £500, £700, £800, you're more than willing to spend that much money on these guitars. And if they're coming out of a CNC machine, then really what makes a huge difference between a guitar that feels like it's come out of a CNC machine, which is that feeling of it being cheaper, where it's like got rougher edges and it's like not very refined. I'm familiar now with that feeling because I ordered a neck from All Parts that was unfinished, and it was just like, well, this feels kind of familiar. This feels like a cheap guitar. What I've realised is it's like the person that then hones that into the actual instrument that makes it stop feeling like a parts guitar and start feeling like a great instrument. So that is the kind of conclusion of one of his conclusions it came to, was that a good setup on an affordable guitar beats a badly set up expensive guitar, which is absolutely true. But equally, I think there's a chance that if you're spending $4,000 on a PRS, that the pressures in the PRS factory in the US and the kind of time that is spent on that guitar, I'm going to assume is greater than the time that is spent over in court on a guitar that costs £400-500, right? £500-600, whatever it ends up being. I still think there's a lot more time that goes into these American-built instruments. I think. Let me know if you disagree with that in the comments. That's the sense that I get from having played a few of these things. And of course there's variable quality all across this, but like a Mexican Fender, similarly, it's like sometimes on a Vintero you might find, oh, those frets needed a bit more time. Someone needed to spend more time working on those. Right? You can make a fairly comfortable living, I think, if you can build up a business building boutique guitars. It just doesn't easily scale in the UK. Likewise in America, like my K-lines, Danacasters, this sort of stuff. These are guitars that are essentially made in a very similar kind of way as a starting point to these other guitars, but then they end up with 1 or 2 guys in a finishing shop that are kind of like luthiers and they just do this day in, day out. Not that different to working in a factory, I guess, in a lot of ways, but I think without as much sort of time pressure, and also a closer link to like the better guitars Chris at K-Line can make. Essentially, he's going to keep that word of mouth and people are going to buy them. You know, that's kind of how that ends up working, right? So you can, I think, maintain boutique quality without scaling up for kind of a longer time. As soon as you try to scale these boutique things like Fender with the CBS kind of thing, I think that's when you start to then see these guitars fall into a little bit more of a, where they're built just means that it was cheaper to build that guitar. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's worse or better or whatever. However, I think boutique guitars built everywhere do have a leg up. Like Eastman guitars, I think they're fairly small still, right? I think, you know, K-Line for me, I really like that. Danicaster I played. The Nachos are not built in great quantities at all, and I think objectively are pretty well put together things, right? Anyway, watch the Chapman's video. I think it's some really interesting points there. And would you rather have a vintage guitar or one made in court? Let me know. But I guess the real thinking is, how many guitar brands out there that are building a guitar with exactly the same specs in a more expensive place to build it, like say California, Japan, somewhere like that, and also building this exact same guitar with the same parts and the same specs, pretty much. There's like a couple of brands like Ibanez with the AZ and Yamaha with the Revstars, and you see like the difference in markup there. Like the reason that those guitars cost more is like a mixture of things, right? It's not the parts in that case, right? It's more kind of the labor costs, the costs of running a company or a warehouse or a factory in Indonesia versus Japan. But also then, on top of that, because there is this perception that where you build a guitar matters still, then you can charge more for a Japanese guitar. You can mark that up more, presumably. But I think where this really leaves you is that the specs really do still matter, because that is like the part that is making a fair amount of difference. If it's a mass-made guitar, does it matter too much that it's made in Indonesia versus Japan? My experience with the Revstars and the Ibanez AZs are that actually it doesn't matter as much as the specs. But most guitar companies, I think, are a little bit cynical in this regard, and they're not just going to build a Fender with exactly the same specs in China or Indonesia as they do in America. Like, you're going to reserve your higher specs for the more expensive guitars. I think that's kind of the reason that you end up getting this guitar made in USA kind of being better than a guitar made in Indonesia, is because actually most guitar companies are reserving the best specs, the best neck carves and all that sort of stuff, if they are mass manufactured guitars, for their American stuff, right? And then you, I guess, intentionally spec things to be a little bit different in Indonesia, like the PRS Silver Sky, like the PRS DGT. You get them close enough, and then you stop trying, I guess. That's a way I presume that you stop cannibalizing some amount of sales if you're building across the world, right? I guess.